Welcome everybody to our Zoom Seekers. A little bit different than what we'd originally planned, but when we're done with the presentation tonight, I sort of have a sneaky surprise, if you will, a little value enhanced. So what I would suggest you do probably, I mean, you can do this any way you want. I'm going to end up setting this up in the view mode as side-by-side speaker. I'm going to eventually hit mute all for most of you guys so we don't get too much background noise. But I'm going to give a PowerPoint presentation on, as you can see on the title slide, Conception Fire 3 years later. What have we learned and what are the steps going forward? If you've got questions while we're going through the presentation, just feel free to unmute yourself and ask. If I can answer, I will, or I'll say let's hold that for a little later on or anything like that. The only, and then as soon when we're done with the presentation itself, we're going to have a wide open forum. I've got a couple of people who have sent me notes that I'm going to read at some point or another. We'd like to hear what you people think, what you're experiencing, what are your concerns, what are your thoughts, and the only real rules are, rules of decorum. Let's keep it as civil as we can. As I was saying to someone earlier today when we're talking about it, I said, think of it as if you're testifying, in a courtroom where you're not going to go, you son of a bitch, but you're going to find a way to say that more politely. So all points of view are welcome, but all we ask you to do is, keep it as well grounded as you possibly can. And so I think that's sort of about it. I'm going to do a couple little things here for our audience. The way it's getting recorded, I set this up as I think, as I said, side-by-side speaker mode, which makes for the least cluttered screens. So whatever works. I'm going to hit mute all for everybody. So again, your microphone's going to go mute, and hopefully mine doesn't.
Ken, you're now about to shut off a lawyer.
Yeah, it's true. I'm very brave, Brad, but I have another lawyer too. So what can I tell you? But I'll tell you, Brad, I'm leaving the box checked here. It says allow participants to unmute themselves. So, so you will be able to unmute if you need to.
All right.
But anyhow, we'll just try to keep the extraneous audio to a minimum. So here we go. All right. So everybody should be able to hear me. I can't see you, so I'm assuming you're going like that. But if you don't know, I'm Ken Curtis. I am the owner of Reef Seekers Dive Company. And obviously the Conception fire, for any of you who don't live in California, was, obviously a big deal here. And it's been 3 years now. So we'd like to sort of do a little review and remind you about some of the details, and then show you what's been found in various reports and how we move ahead going forward. And I have some caveats here. So what you need to know is I do work as a legal expert at times in dive litigation, but I am not retained or working for anybody on this case. But I am friends with Glenn Fritzler, who's the owner of Truth Aquatics, and whose name you've probably heard mentioned before. I did know one of the victims. She was one of my advanced students. I sometimes, as many of you who know me well will understand, I use humor as a coping tool. It's not meant to be insulting or anything to anybody. So hopefully you understand that. I'm not here to advocate or apologize. I'm just trying to lay out some of the facts for you. I will try to tell you what things happen to be. Oh, this is more my opinion than anything else, and delineate with that. We got a fair amount of ground to cover. We're not intending to gloss things over, but this is the type of thing we could talk for hours and hours and hours about. But I'll also mention, I mentioned in the email, normally we try to wrap these things up by 9. I'm happy to 9 Pacific time. I'm happy to keep this going if you've got questions and things to talk about as long as you want. So when I said at the end it will be an open-ended discussion, I really do mean that. This is one of my favorite little memes off the internet, and it reminds us all that perspective matters. The guy on the left sees a 6, guy on the right sees a 9. From their own perspectives, they're both correct. And it's just a way to remind us that we're all going to look at this differently. And that doesn't mean your viewpoint is necessarily incorrect. We hope everything, is based on actual facts, but just realize that people are going to have different perspectives on, different things, looking at the exact same set of facts. So let's go through the timeline, just remind you sort of what happened. Roughly 2:35 in the morning, one of the crew members said he did a galley sweep, put his hand on the griddle, all was good. Somewhere after 3 a.m., we don't know the exact time, 3:05, 3:10, in that range, a crew member hears a bump and actually didn't pay much attention, then finally decided he was going to get up, opened the door. These are crew members up on the wheelhouse. Opened the door, sees what he termed a yellow glow emanating from the main deck. There's also testimony there that he heard a sound that he characterized as ah, but no one really knows what that is. We do know this time to be correct. 3:14 in the morning was when the Mayday call went out to the U.S. Coast Guard from the boat that was on fire, and that Mayday call was made by Jerry Boylan, who's the captain. 3:30, there's some various back and forth on the radio. 3:30, Coast Guard deploys assets, and all that means is they give the call out to whatever boats or helicopters or anything they have available, and say, here's where you need to go. And this one has not just application for this particular accident, but the first U.S. Coast Guard search and rescue unit was on the scene almost 1 hour later at 4:27. That is not a criticism of the Coast Guard at all, but it's just to indicate that a lot of times when we're involved in anything, whether it's, a diver who's bent or embolized or whatever, sometimes your impression is, oh, we'll just make a radio call and help will be here in 3 or 4 minutes. And that's just not the case. So almost an hour later, first Coast Guard rescue units are on the scene. The boat was fully engulfed at that point. At 5:08, so about half an hour, a little more than half an hour after that, the fire was extinguished. They were pumping seawater and stuff to put out the fire. There were some subsequent flare-ups after that. And 6:54 a.m., so roughly 2 hours later, now just the burned out hull of the Conception, that's all that was left at that point, sinks. So the weird, scary, whatever word you want to use, this all happened on September 2nd. 2 months later, on November 1st, there is a second fire. This one's on the Red Sea Aggressor, in the Red Sea. Eerily similar scenario. Passengers go to sleep late in the evening. A little after midnight, passengers smell smoke. And just so you know, I was on this boat in 2015. Bunks down below, middle deck, upper deck, contains sun deck, stuff like that. Passengers sound a verbal alarm. The stairwell from the staterooms to the salon, so going up to the salon, which would normally be the exit, blocked by fire. That stairwell is at the back of the stateroom area. At the front of the stateroom area, there is an escape hatch that led directly into the wheelhouse. So that's where the passengers went. That escape route was blocked by a crewman sleeping up against the little hatch cover, so they had to push him away. It does seem on that boat, all the crew was asleep. There was no night watch person. 17 passengers and the crew abandoned ship as flames engulfed the ship. One passenger ended up dying on that one. So a really similar scenario to what happened on the Conception. And one of the big questions is, does this happen on boats more often than we know? I mean, I can just tell you from what I know of, I've never heard of this kind of thing happening except for these 2 times. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't boats that catch on fire. I do not recall which boat or which line it was, but there was a dive boat within the last 3-4 months. I want to say it was in Indonesia, Malaysia, Komodo area, caught on fire. It was during the day. It was an engine room fire, though. And in fact, that seems to be a lot of times the assumption is that these are engine room fires. And I believe I'm remembering this correctly, that the NTSB, when they came out initially, just assumed this was probably going to be another engine room fire, and then quickly decided, no, it was not. And we'll talk about that a little later on. So we really do think this is a rare type of occurrence. There are some sources that I've used to get some of the information I'm about to present, and I did this through Google. So these are the words you can type into Google, and I'm gonna give you links in the chat in just a second. But if you type in NTSB conception report, you'll get a link to the actual NTSB report. If you type in USCG conception fire rules, you'll get a link to the new fire rules. And if you want to type in USCG conception fire rules CFR, CFR stands for Code of Federal Regulations, you will get the actual regulations. And I am, if I do this right, whoops, nope, hang on one second. I got to move my cursor over here. Boom. If you look in the chat, I just put the direct links to those two documents. So you can cut and paste that stuff out of the chat if you want to go through that. The NTSB report is, if I'm recalling right, top of my head, like 200 pages. I mean, it's very, very, very detailed with illustrations and photographs and everything else. The Coast Guard conception fire rules is a dozen pages or so, and the CFRs are pretty comprehensive. Be aware of the politics of all of this while it was going on. You had the NTSB, National Transportation Safety Board, the FBI, Department of Justice, local agencies, all involved. They don't always play nice together. And it is very unusual for one agency to be criticizing another. So one thing that I found politically brave and I think appropriate in the NTSB report is they do take the Coast Guard to task for regulatory or lack of sometimes regulatory oversight. And that's real unusual. And again, you should probably appreciate the unusualness of that. Here's a timeline on when everything was going on. The accident happened September 20th, 2019. The NTSB report was a little over a year later, October 20th, 2020. The U.S. Coast Guard rules were published in the Federal Register, December 27th, 2021. So more than 2 years after the actual accident. The rules were to take effect March 28th. Some of them are being rolled in, but basically they were in effect as of March 28th. Civil litigation, ongoing. Criminal litigation, ongoing. The legal landscape changed a little bit a couple of weeks ago. On September 1st, the charges were, there were 34 counts of what's called seaman's manslaughter against Jerry Boylan, the captain. And that was reduced to one count. His attorneys argued that this all revolves around the roving watchman or lack thereof, that he made one decision about the roving watchman, not 34 decisions. And so if you count that as the negligent act, it is one negligent act that results in 34 deaths. So there should be one charge, not 34. And the judge agreed with that. The next day, though, the judge dismissed the criminal charges based on the fact that the charging documents from DOJ alleged simple negligence, and there are manslaughter statutes, and I'm getting beyond my expertise definitely here, but there are manslaughter statutes that require gross negligence, simple versus gross negligence. There are some legal distinctions, but basically the judge dismissed the charges against Boylan on the basis that essentially the Department of Justice did not file them correctly, that they alleged simple negligence, not gross negligence, and that they had to allege gross negligence, which is harder to prove. That will all be appealed without a doubt. The charges may get reinstated, but that's where things are right now. And the civil actions are still pending, but most likely delayed due to the criminal actions being delayed, because it seems that they want to finish up some of the criminal stuff before they really get into the civil stuff. What actions have the industry taken voluntarily almost right away? Well, obviously, divers and operators have a much better heightened general awareness of some of the issues that happened in this fire. The SoCal boats are not allowing anyone to sleep on board overnight on day trips. It used to be. Go ahead, David. You have a question?
No, I got a message that it said the host wants me to unmute. I have no questions.
You're now on mute. The SoCal boats a lot of times would let you sleep on board the night before, or if you had a really early morning departure. They can still do that, just so you're clear as to what's what. But to do that, they would have to have a crew person awake overnight as the roving watch anytime that passengers have access to the sleeping accommodation. So that's pretty much the reason they don't allow anyone to sleep on board overnight, because now they don't have to have the roving watchman. There were improvements made voluntarily to escape hatches and escape routes. Some boats started tying together their fire alarms and smoke detectors. And just to give you an idea of some of the things, so again, the conception was part of Truth Aquatics, which was Truth Conception and Vision. Glenn has sold the Truth and the Conception now to Channel Islands Expeditions, but I pulled this off the website just to give you an idea of what the Vision looks like. The Conception bunk room layout was similar. So here we're looking straight down. Here's the bunk room. This is the one escape hatch that was there. You can see the stairs sort of in the upper right. The stairs that are in yellow go from the bunk room up to the galley. The stairs that are in white are actually from the shower room, which is located in the bow there. So the escape hatch was the only escape hatch, and the one you've probably heard about was in the back of the bunk area right there. Now, since then, and actually this happened while Glenn still owned the boats, they have added 2 escape hatches that lead out to the weather deck. Weather deck is a term we use. It means it's outside of the galley area, what's called the house sometimes. It's the open deck spaces. And if there's one lesson that came out of here right away, it was the idea of, if we have stairs that go into the galley, an escape hatch goes into the same galley, that's not really a second exit. And that we really needed to rethink where that second exit is going to be, and it needs to go somewhere else. So they put in these 2 escape hatches to go out to the weather deck. They
I
made
do have
some.
a question now.
Sure, go ahead, Dave.
Sorry, you told me that when you
Go
asked
ahead.
me about if I had a question, I didn't hear what you said. The reason that nobody could sleep on the boats is that there's not a night watchman now? Is that on all boats, or you're allowed to have
The
a night-
requirement, just so you understand, the requirement for anyone who's sleeping in the boats now is that there has to be a night watchman on duty. And basically, the boats don't want to pay a crewman to be on duty overnight, so you can sleep on board and instead of getting up at 5 in the morning to make it down to the boat for 7 a.m. departure. So it's not that they can't allow people to sleep on board. It's that it's going to cost them. They're going to have to assign a crewman and have them pay for that. And most of the boats don't want to do that.
Right, like
and we'll get to
Okay,
something else in a little bit, that there's a semi exception to that.
at
This
the
was
Magi-
prior, this
Go ahead,
was
Susie.
prior to COVID, but there were a couple of situations where we agreed to pay a crew person out of our own
Right.
pocket so we could sleep. It
And
was
that's
like,
what
we were-
Right. And I was actually going to mention that later on in one of the written comments I'd gotten, exactly that. A lot of times if the charters want to pay for a crew person to stay up overnight, whatever that would cost, and I don't know what that is, it's fine. So again, to be clear, the rule is if there are passengers on the boat, there has to be a crew person awake. So that if you're just sleeping on the dock, and I mean, I will tell you for years, like when we used to run day trips to Catalina on the Maverick, I would go down and sleep on the boat. And I'd get down there at midnight and go to sleep and, get up at 7 in the morning when everybody got on board. And that would be a violation right now based on the new regulations. So here's something
Yeah.
else again. Go ahead. Did you have something else, Liz?
I have a question.
Sure.
The way I understood it, this regulation actually existed in 2019 and before. It isn't really a new regulation, is it? Or am I wrong?
I may be splitting hairs here, but I would say it is a clearer regulation. And I will bring up in a couple of slides the actual wording of the regulations. And one thing you're going to see, and some of this, I want you to appreciate this from the boat captain's perspective too, as to what they have to deal with. A lot of the stuff was written very vaguely. So it was talking about things that when a boat is underway overnight, you had to have a roving watchman, but it was never specifically said, if you're at the dock and there are passengers on board, you need to have an overnight, roving watchman. So it was, I'd say, a little unclear the way things are written. And part of what they're doing is doing a better job of defining what the regulations actually are.
I was on The Magician about 3 weeks ago, and they said for $500 that you could pay to have someone sleep over a crew member.
Sure. And again, the point is, if anybody wants to pay the money to pay the crewman, it's fine. But obviously the boats don't want to, increase their expense that way for you just to come on board and sleep. So that's the deal with that. This is also, by the way, on the Vision. And just to show you, and again, we'll get into the recommendations and stuff. This is one of the new smoke alarms. And you can see from the wiring, it is wired in. So one of the things is smoke alarms need to be wired. So if one goes off, they all go off. One of the things not required, but the Vision did that I thought was a great idea, is there are fire pull stations. Same idea. Pull that and alarms are going to go off everywhere. And you can see with the wires that, it's wired in all the way around. One of the, I don't remember if it's in the actual report and the findings from NTSB, but one of the things that they certainly discussed was the idea there was no real way, and not just on the Conception, just about every boat, there's no real way to communicate necessarily, through all the decks up and down. Yeah, maybe there's a speaker in the bunk room, and if the captain's on the PA, you would hear that, but there was no way to communicate from the bunk room up to the captain or up to the main deck or anything else. So something like a fire alarm like this certainly takes care of that. One other thing, in case it comes up in our discussion, I don't really have it in my part of the presentation, but we talk about smoke inhalation, and most of the, I think all of the causes of death were officially ascribed to smoke inhalation. And one of the things we talked about over the years in this is the idea that there was individual ventilation in each of the bunks on the Conception as well as on the Vision. The red circle just shows you where that ventilation is. There's a similar one up there. So one of the thoughts is, with the smoke inhalation, did these vents basically suck in smoke from the outside and basically deliver them to every single bunk before some people even had a chance to get out of the bunk? So just as an understanding point, that's where those vents are. So back to the industry actions. Some of the boats, couple boats I know of, have taken to video monitoring. They've hooked up cameras so they can pretty much from the wheelhouse see the entire boat in all the various areas. I think that's a terrific idea. Just little home security cameras. A lot of the boats are doing better briefings now and making sure you understand where various exits are and everything else. Boats are obviously much more aware of overnight watches. As far as the boats, certainly the boats I travel on, I don't do much local diving anymore, but I'm certainly not overnight stuff. But the foreign trips I go on, there is no overnight charging of batteries anymore. There in some places are limited locations for charging stations. Some boats have installed specialized charging cabinets that are fire resistant, if not even maybe fireproof. There's certainly a heightened awareness of the dangers of rechargeable batteries. We'll talk about that in a little bit more in detail. And as I said, a similar awareness on all this on international trips. I did a trip in the Maldives, I want to say, a month or so after the Conception fire, and they were very aware of what was going on. So who's affected by all this? Well, the magic words are small passenger vessel. So small is under 100 gross tons. To give you an idea, the Conception, I think, was 97 gross tons. The Catalina Express big boats are like 200 gross tons. So Conception-sized boats. So basically, most of the dive boats in certainly the Southern California area. Passenger vessel means it carries 6 to 150 people, and the vessel could be used for diving, kayaking, etc. What's missing is the word commercial. So it is not necessarily defined as a commercial vessel, so that if you take out 12 of your friends on your own private boat, you maybe could be affected by some of this. I'm not 100% certain of that, but just something to be aware of. And speaking of boats, you'll if you read through the literature, you'll hear two kinds of vessels. Subchapter T vessels, basically what the Conception was, under 100 gross tons, 150 passenger or less. Overnight accommodations for 49 people or less. If you read through the COIs of any of our dive boats, a lot of times you'll see it says overnight accommodations for 49 people. That's why, because that's the limit. If you're a subchapter K vessel, still under 100 gross tons, but now you basically are carrying more people, more than 150, more than 49 overnight, and K vessels may also be affected by some of this. So let's get down into the real meat of stuff and what the NTSB findings were after their year-long investigation. And they basically came up with 4 safety issues. Lack of small passenger vessel regulations requiring smoke detection in all accommodation spaces. You did not have to have smoke detectors all over the boat. Is that necessarily a good idea? That may have factored into people not being aware of what was going on. Lack of a roving patrol. And again, these are findings specific to the Conception fire. Small passenger vessel construction regulations for a means of escape were not necessarily clear or adequate, and ineffective company oversight, specifically saying Truth Aquatics had a responsibility to be dealing with all this stuff, and they felt that they were not. The NTSB, this is what these are the actual words that they said out of their report. National Transportation Safety Board determines that the probable cause of the accident on board the small passenger vessel Conception was the failure of Truth Aquatics Inc. to provide effective oversight of its vessel and crew member operations, including requirements to ensure that a roving patrol was maintained, which allowed a fire of unknown cause to grow undetected in the vicinity of the aft salon on the main deck. Contributing to the undetected growth of the fire was the lack of a United States Coast Guard regulatory requirement for smoke detection in all accommodation spaces. Contributing to the high loss of life were the inadequate emergency escape arrangements from the vessel's bunk room, as both exited into a compartment that was engulfed in fire, thereby preventing escape. So to be clear, that is a direct quote out of the NTSB report. Now, the NTSB separately then makes recommendations as to what they would like to see happen. It's important to understand they are an investigative agency. They can only recommend. They don't write the regulations. That's sent up to Coast Guard. Congress got involved in this as well. But here were the recommendations from the NTSB. Require newly constructed vessels with overnight accommodations to have smoke detectors in all accommodation spaces. And this should apply to pre-1996 vessels. Prior to 96, there were different regulations. New regulations came in effect in 1996, and any existing vessel at that time was exempted from those new regulations. So that's why you have this retroactive to apply to basically all vessels. Smoke detectors also, NTSB recommendation, should be interconnected. So that's number 1. Number 2, Coast Guard should develop inspection procedures to ensure vessels are in compliance with existing roving patrol requirements. My opinion, that's going to be a little tough. Obviously, the Coast Guard can't visit every single boat at 3 a.m. to find out if there's a roving patrol. So, and you'll see some suggestions in a little bit as to how they plan on dealing with that. Require newly constructed vessels with overnight accommodations to have a secondary means of escape into a different space than the primary exit, so the fire should not affect both escape paths. Again, should apply to pre-96 vessels. And additionally, ensure there are no obstructions to egress on the pre-1996 vessels. One of the criticisms of the escape hatch on the Conception, same design as on the Vision, same design was on the Charisma, then became the Great Escape, and on the Encore, is the hatch opened up into a little, I don't know what you want to call it, a cubby hole, if you will, that you can make an argument that made it tough for people to get out. So no obstructions to egress to get out. And implementation of a safety management system. Safety management system is basically a notebook, if you will, of all your safety requirements. And so if people have questions like crew people, they can consult that. And the thought is that by having that written down, accessible, that improves a culture of safety. Ken's opinion, it's a great idea, but if nobody ever looks at it, I mean, that's the key. If you're going to have it there, it has to get used. And how do you really enforce that? Not sure. But those are the 4 recommendations from NTSB. So the Coast Guard took all that allegedly into account. And in December of 21, and they had a press conference about this in January 22, they announced 8 new rules. So the new rules involve improving crew member firefighting and training proficiency, have interconnected fire detection equipment, and also more fire extinguishers on the boat, install a monitoring device to ensure the wakefulness of the night watch. That could be a buzzer that has to be pushed every so often. If you've ever worked in a large office building, sometimes you've seen these little key stations that the watchmen go around. They have to stick a key in, and there's a key in there, and they carry a little thing that shows they've been to various places. So there's a number of ways to possibly do that. Increased fire detection and suppression system in unmanned areas. Minimum 2 avenues, unobstructed escape, and one cannot be above a berth. Improved handling, storage, operation of flammables, such as rechargeable batteries, including lithium-ion ones. Require passenger emergency egress drills. That one's going to be interesting, and we'll cover that a little bit more in a minute. Provide all passengers with a copy of the emergency egress plan. One thing to note about these, sort of with the exception of number 6, everything's more reactive than proactive. In other words, it's telling you what to do after the fire breaks out. Oh, we need to have better firefighting training. We have to have fire detection equipment and all that kind of stuff. It's not necessarily dealing with how does the fire start and what can we do to prevent it from even starting. Number 6 deals with that a little bit, but they don't really get very specific. And again, as people who keep going on these boats, these are probably things we'd want to know more about. So this I found interesting. And again, one of the problems in writing this stuff is you're trying to write in ways that it covers everybody, but sometimes it means you water things down. So the Elijah E. Cummings Coast Guard Act, blah, 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 blah. The prescribed fire safety regulations for certain covered small passenger vessels defined as small passenger vessels, SPVs, with overnight accommodations for passengers or operating on oceans or coastwise routes, excluding fishing vessels and ferries. Notice that excluding. Now, they're trying to exclude, whoops, I didn't mean to go to that. That's okay. They're trying to exclude boats like you see in, what the heck's it called? The guys who operate in Alaska on the crab boats and stuff like that. My concern is that will be interpreted as, gee, if I have my dive boat just taking fishermen out, none of this applies, and that's not supposed to be the case. So I think that could be written a little bit more clearly. Also in the new rules heading, and these are the quotes from the Coast Guard. Vessels already in service must submit plans to the cognizant OCMI, officer in charge of marine inspections, I think is what that stands for. It accords with existing stuff. Vessels with a keel laid after in this year include plans for monitoring devices within the plan submissions. That's for the roving watchman. The Coast Guard will work with vessel operators to determine a reasonable implementation schedule once plans are accepted. Plan submission requirement will be effective 90 days after the publication of this interim rule. The main goal for requiring use and installation of the monitoring devices to ensure the required watchmen stay awake while monitoring the vessel for emergencies. Now, bear in mind, this is stuff that the boat captains then have to start complying with. And one of their complaints sometimes is this stuff gets very vague. One of the issues, if you notice in the middle there, the Coast Guard will work with the vessel operators to determine a reasonable schedule once the plans are accepted. When the new escape hatches were being put on the Vision, they had them in the way they had discussed. And when they were asked to have the Coast Guard inspect them, the Coast Guard said, well, we can't approve them yet because we don't have any standards and specifications for what it needs to be. So even though we could say it looks fine, we need to have something in writing to say, oh yeah, now we know why it's fine. So there's sort of a catch-22 that sometimes goes on there. More things the captains have to deal with. The monitoring devices must satisfy the following 3 requirements, which have incorporated into the regulatory text. They got to alert the crew in case of an unresponsive watchstander, so some sort of an alarm. The requirement ensures that if the watchman becomes unresponsive, the crew is alerted to check on the unresponsive watchman, provide a continuous safety watch throughout the night. Secondly, the monitoring device must remain operable throughout the nighttime watch, and which requires watchmen patrolling throughout the nighttime. And third, the monitoring device must be arranged to ensure proper coverage of the passenger accommodation spaces, common areas, spaces with potential fire hazards, We're requiring the devices be arranged with proper coverage around the vessel to ensure that those assigned with a watchkeeping responsibility remain alert while conducting frequent rounds of the vessel. By my count, the Conception had at least 6 or 7 different areas. You've got the main deck salon, you've got the back deck number 2, engine room number 3, lazarette number 4, bunk rooms number 5, shower areas forward of in the bow area number 6, wheelhouse number 7, and at what point you have someone just continuously running around a deck. So I'm hoping these can be made a little bit more narrowed down a little bit, and I'll be curious to see what you guys think of all this as well. So again, what they're trying to do is ensure the wakefulness of the crew person. You got to keep it operating all night long and make sure that you can ensure that they're covering all areas of the vessel. This one's going to be interesting. Let me take a sip here. Passenger egress drills. So the master of the vessel, that would be the captain or the owner, must conduct passenger emergency egress drills from the passengers assigned overnight accommodation spaces prior to beginning of an excursion with new passengers. Basically, they have to take everybody and do an emergency exit drill. And I believe this is in effect now. So if you've been diving on a boat since March 28th, when these would have taken effect, the question is, have you ever done an egress drill? Because this does not just apply, from the way I'm reading the wording, this does not apply necessarily just to an overnight trip. But if you have accommodations, you got to do the egress drill. Number 1 in the middle there says if you're not specifically assigned an accommodation, you still got to do the drill. And number 2 says, for the purpose of this section, excursion includes any time the vessel gets underway or any time passengers remain overnight on the vessel. To me, that says if you leave at 7 in the morning, that's considered underway, got to do a drill. And obviously, if passengers are overnight. So what are the specific areas that we as divers should really be thinking about? Obviously, where and how did the fire start? The assumption is it was a bad battery. The assumption is it started somewhere in the aft part of the salon. There is no definitive evidence of that. And that's one reason NTSB stuff is all evidence-based. That's one reason they really don't address the battery issue, because they can't say for sure this battery blew up and that's what started the fire. That is obviously something we as divers, we're not only going on these boats, but we're the ones bringing the batteries on, need to be aware of. How did the fire spread so quickly? I know a number of years ago, I sent out a video that showed a battery exploding, and it's amazing how big the flames and stuff are. And a lot of these boats, especially the older boats, they're wooden, they're fiberglass, there's flammable materials inside the galley area. You may have coats and stuff strewn around. So it's not necessarily a surprise that the boats go up so quickly, but it's certainly not something we ever really expected. The roving watchman is obviously the biggest thing that came out of this whole investigation and what we learned about this. Now, the thing is, the lay people think of a roving watchman sort of like security guard with lunch pail going up. On a boat, it's obviously very, very different. And there's a big difference between larger commercial vessels or military vessels and the type of boats we're used to going on. Military ships have ships that go, they've got crew on duty 24 hours a day. They've got enough people to do that. Cruise ship, cargo ships operate similarly, not so much with dive boats. Dive boats usually have, depending on the size of the boat, 2, 4, 6 crew people, small crews. And usually they're pulling a night watch on top of whatever their daytime duties are. And maybe as an industry, we need to say that's not such a good idea. And so the question is, should there be a person whose dedicated job, they work from midnight to 8 or 10 to 6 or whatever the hours are, and their dedicated shift is they're the night watch person? Because do you want someone who's been up all day and maybe went to bed at midnight and then they pulled the 2 to 4 a.m. watch shift, so they got 2 hours sleep, and now we got them up to do 2 to 4, and are they going to stay up, and will that be a problem? So that's something we need to really think about. Within the Code of Federal Regulations, I think it was mentioned earlier, what's the actual requirement to have a watch person? This is actually it. And here are the key phrases there, that the master of the vessel shall have a suitable number of watchmen patrol. Well, what if you decide, and again, my concern always is the vagueness. What is a suitable number? What if you decide that number is 0? Can you decide that number is 0? Is it 1? Is it 2? Is it 5? Is it one person in every accommodation space? What is a suitable number? Patrol throughout the vessel. Does it mean they need to be moving all the time? There's certainly an argument to be made. If you think of the way most of our dive boats are constructed, if I'm in that salon area on the main deck, I've got my eyes on about 90% of the vessel, and it's very easy to stick your head every now and then and somewhere else. So how much do you want them moving around? Because if part of the requirement is, no, you have to go down into the engine room every so often, well, you're definitely out of sight of the rest of the vessel. Are we creating a different danger while we're trying to solve another one? And again, to guard against and give alarm in case of a fire. And most of the time, especially when underway, I think a lot of the boat guys I've talked to said fire was not their main concern. It was, does someone fall overboard, who gets up in the middle of the night and is going to the bathroom and stumbles, and over they go. So we need to be aware of all the dangers that are on the boat. And one of the things, I've said this before about human nature, if something that didn't happen had happened, and this applies to the roving watchman, the thing that did happen wouldn't have happened. So one of the, I think, logical traps to fall into here is say, well, only if there had been a roving watchman, none of this would have happened. Would have put out the fire, gotten everybody out, or whatever. If the thing that didn't happen had happened, then the thing that did happen, bad thing wouldn't have happened. I don't think that's the case. I mean, here are the various scenarios with the roving watchman. When the fire breaks out, he could have been in the bunk room, been trapped with everybody else. He could have been standing in the galley by the exploding battery, and he's killed in the explosion. Could have been down in the engine room, doesn't know the fire is raging, comes up to find the same thing. Or in this case, there's someone up in the wheelhouse, unaware of the fire below until they find a reason to go out. In my opinion, and it's strictly my opinion, there is no guarantee, even with a roving watchman, that the outcomes would have been any different. And again, to me, the roving, we need to get, I think, a good definition of the roving, because I can see instances where we're complying with what the bureaucratically written standard is, and in doing so, taking us out of an area of observation, and maybe, again, increasing the danger we're trying to prevent. I don't know. I'm curious to hear what you guys think about that. Escape hatch. Again, back to the vision. These were the accommodations. The 2 red arrows are the new escape hatches that open out to the deck. I think that's a great idea. But again, to give you perspective on the escape hatch, which was criticized at various times by one of the NTSB members. Airline seats are 18 to 19 inches wide. So everyone's probably sat in an airline seat, give you perspective. On the Conception, the escape hatch was about 22 by 22. Now, I'm not going to say that's huge, but it's bigger than an airline seat. There were no regulations specifying a minimum dimension. Coast Guard inspected the vessel as well as other vessels similarly equipped every single year and passed it. Post 96, and I think I got the right CFR quoted there, quote, asked for hatches to be 32 inches wide, but no one ever asked the pre-96 boats to update. And I looked up what is the requirement for the overwing exit on an airplane, which is sort of similar when you think about it to a secondary escape hatch in a boat. And the requirement, and again, I got a different CFR quoted there, for an airplane wing is 19 by 26. So really not that much different in size. In fact, a little narrower than the one on Conception. On top of that, airplanes have to be evacuated in 90 seconds, full load, get everybody off in 90 seconds to be certified for flight. And so the real question is, should we have a similar standard for boats? That doesn't mean you'd have to do that every time you go out on a trip, because obviously you've been on an airplane flight and they haven't said, hey, everybody's got to get off in 90 seconds or we can't leave the gate. But should there be tests run on boats, how long does it take to evacuate a bunk room, and what should the standard be? Again, in the new rules, and I'm just reemphasizing these because if you're going out on boats, this is stuff that they're supposed to be doing now. Must conduct passenger egress drills. Again, must conduct. And excursion includes any time the vessel gets underway. So I'm not sure if that's being done or not. I'd be curious to hear if any of you have experienced that or not yet.
Ken?
Yeah.
With the egress drill, does that mean that you have to go through the escape hatch, find them and go through them?
It could. It means you would certainly have to know where it is. You would have to be shown where it is. To me, the idea of an egress drill would be everybody in the bunk room. Okay, let's get everybody out. But again, it's vaguely, in my opinion, vaguely defined. So what's acceptable, what's not? And I'm not sure what the answer to that would be. And that's something that hopefully between boat operators and Coast Guard, we can figure out over time. Couple more points and we're almost to the, ask all your questions thing. Breathing in a fire, very difficult to do. Superheated air sears your lungs. The fire in the galley was consuming oxygen. In doing so, it's probably drawing up air from the bunk room, burning up that oxygen, as well as creating carbon monoxide. And so you run into a real problem with asphyxiation, lack of O2, as well as smoke inhalation. Now, some boats, and I'll single out the Nautilus liveaboards, and as you know, I deal with Nautilus a lot. This isn't the one they have on, but they've added smoke hoods to all their boats, and everybody's got one in their room. And the idea of a smoke hood is you put it on, and it filters the smoke out, and you can get out of a smoky room. Should that be a requirement? Again, one of the problems obviously gets to be added expense. At what point do you make the safety improvements so financially burdensome on the boat operators that they say, I just can't afford to do this anymore. This is not a viable thing. The elephant in the room, not addressed really, are rechargeable batteries. And that is something that we as divers, we as an industry really need to think about. Last Friday, Los Angeles Veterans Administration, they have on the west side of their campus off of San Vicente and Wilshire, a bunch of tiny homes. There was a fire, burned, I think, 11 or 12 of the homes and damaged 4 others. And boy, does that picture look familiar. From the LA Times, fire likely was caused by lithium batteries that overheated while charging in one of the shelters, according to LAFD spokesman Brian Humphrey. So the point is that the batteries, they're not just going to cause fires on boats. They can cause fires anywhere. I was talking to a friend of mine who's up in Santa Barbara. There was a house that burned down there, that there was a fire in, I don't remember if it was a rechargeable battery in the garage, set the entire house on fire, fire burned down. So a couple things to understand about the rechargeables. And the ironic thing with all this is not something the boat guys are doing. We are the people bringing the dangerous stuff on board. So you have a duty, if you're bringing rechargeables on board, to really check them out ahead of time and make sure they're not bulging or look like they're leaking or failing or whatever, and make sure that they're in good shape, because we're the ones bringing these little things on board. And the bottom line is, the rechargeables are everywhere. Cell phones, laptops, cameras. I mean, I guarantee you right now, within 20 feet of wherever you're sitting, there's 3 or 4 rechargeables. I mean, I got them here. I've got a tablet. I've got a laptop going. They're everywhere. So we need to make sure everything is as safe as can be. I love the idea of the no overnight charging. We might need to codify that a little bit. And one of the things I'd be curious about as we chat about this is, what do you think about this stuff? And maybe we just say no overnight charging. We define that as 11 to 6 a.m., 11 p to 6 a.m. Once it's 11 o'clock, let's unplug everything. You can plug stuff back in at 6 a.m. Should we limit the number of batteries being charged at any given time? I mean, I'm sure we've all been on boats where there's 30 or 40 things being charged. Should we limit the use of daisy chain power strips? I plug my power strip into an outlet. I plug another power strip into my power strip, and maybe another power strip into that. So one outlet suddenly is doing 10, 15 chargers all on that one thing. And maybe it's not the chargers that fail, it's the power strips that fail. Should boats have fire resistant charging cabinets? I know a couple of boats have done that. Should there be specific outlets and areas reserved for charging? And simple thing, should you just be required to unplug when fully charged? You know, if your battery's charged and if the problem is overcharging and that's what's causing the explosions, you know, when it's fully charged, let's unplug it. These are things to think about. These are things that we could voluntarily adopt. These are things that Coast Guard could consider to make a regulatory part of the CFRs. They're options. The bottom line in all this is never again. We don't ever want this to happen again, whether it's on a California boat or some other boat. And hopefully we're all on the same page with saying, what do we need to do to make sure this never happens again? And these are some of the things that we've learned in the last 3 years. So hopefully we give you some food for thought here. And now we are hoping that we will have our open forum here. I need to do a couple of things. So a couple of things just for how this will work logistically. If you can, there's a raise hand icon somewhere down there. I think it's under reactions. If you can use your raise hand icon, it makes it easier for me to spot you. If that doesn't work, just raise your hand. And I will try to call on people and we'll try to get everybody in. I need to stop my share over here so I can actually see everybody. What you might do is, depending on what view you want to use, go to, you can do it. If you want to see everybody, go on gallery, or the speaker view will show you the active speaker and you'll see everybody else around as a gallery. But what I want to do before we open it up to everybody is I want to single out one person who's on the call and give him a chance to make a couple of comments. And this is Adam Tucker, who is works for the NTSB. He was the lead investigator in the Conception fire. And he's been listening to this, and he's in Florida, so he's 3 hours away, and he's got an early morning flight to DC. But Adam, was there anything that you would either like to say or add to what we've covered here before we open up the floor?
No, first of all, thanks, Ken, and thank you everybody for allowing me to attend. I have to say I've learned a lot just in this discussion alone, so I appreciate it. I'm here on my own free will. I just wanted to clear the air right away. I'm not representing the NTSB. I am a certified diver. I have an interest in diving. I've been on many day trip type dive boats, however, never been on board the live aboard vessels. So I just wanted to clear the air there. You know, it's really interesting for me, and certainly from my side of my area of interest, to hear from you what has changed out there, again, staying with the topic of the presentation that's there. But I'm available to answer any questions as well if people do have questions, you know, so I'm here for that.
Cool. So I'll give him the caveat that there may be things that he may say, I can't address that because of the ongoing litigation, because even though he is not here in an official capacity, he is still an employee of the NTSB, and he would like to have a job tomorrow. So what do you guys think about the steps that have been taken? Should there be more steps taken? What are your collective thoughts? Who wants to be brave and start out? Brad, I see you're unmuted, so I'm gonna.
Well, no, I was just going to say that I've been on, I suppose, 3 day boats since, or 4 in the last year, and there was a lot of attention. They all went to Catalina. There was a lot of attention, or actually one was Anacapa. A lot of attention paid to how to exit the boat, if you're on top, if you're on the deck. But they really didn't talk about what if you go down below and you're sleeping, taking a nap, or, you know, getting your changing clothes or whatever. And there wasn't a lot of attention paid, if any, to where the escape hatches were down below. So I think there's a little bit of a sense of we're not an overnight boat. Nobody's sleeping on this boat overnight. Not many people are going down below. We really don't need to talk about how you would evacuate if somehow a fire started down below during the day. So that's just something I noticed.
And Adam, quick question for you. Would you agree with me that the way the rules are written, if you're doing a day trip that leaves at 7 a.m, you still need to do the egress drills? Or they
I would
intend to
say
do?
yes.
Yeah,
Well,
Yeah. And back to your point earlier about what's a drill.
Yeah.
I don't think the intent of the regulation is to make every single person climb a ladder and climb through a hatch and anything like
Right.
that. Again, many people do have mobility issues. Now, those
Yeah.
mobility issues may go away in the event of an actual emergency, but certainly there's no intent for
Hmm.
anybody to harm themselves, especially in the smaller type egress routes that are.
see, in my
that are
experience,
there.
Adam, is I don't find too many divers with mobility issues, but boy, do I find
True
a lot.
that.
But I was gonna say, do I ever find a lot with attention deficit syndrome?
Well,
Oh, I'm sorry, I wasn't listening. I wasn't paying any attention to what you said. Glenn, you had your hand up and it went away. Did you decide your question was answered?
No, it wasn't a question. I mostly dive on liveaboards now. And some liveaboards, like the Nautilus, they spend a lot of time and energy on safety, fire safety as well. I have had occasion to be on a liveaboard just recently where they actually had the charging stations in a separate room. And they have a thing called a fireball. And these are balls that when they essentially melt with temperature, they are a fire extinguisher, automatic fire extinguisher. So I'm thinking that because lithium ion batteries are not well studied in terms of different charging rates and chargers and cables and so on and so forth.
Glenn, you just muted yourself. We lost your audio.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay, so my takeaway is that perhaps it would be better, especially for the battery issue, is to isolate the charging area somehow and then have maybe something like those fireballs in place, because it's sort of a no-brainer
Yeah,
as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you, Dennis. Dennis, your hand is up. You're up. Dennis,
where's Dennis?
I don't know. His hand is up, but he's not unmuting. Well, while we're getting his hand up, unless he changed his mind, I want to share with you a note I got from a guy. He is a captain and a diver and a passenger at times. He's worked before for Truth Aquatics. He is not working for him now for no particular reason. And he's also done like ferries and other stuff. And he just sent me a note, and here are some of his thoughts just about all these various things. And again, opening up for discussion if anybody has any comments. Improved safety hatch to the weather deck as part of orientation. Crew conducts a tour that includes each passenger navigating the stairs and opening the hatch from the boat's interior and exiting to the weather deck. Watch keeping. Interesting. Specifically at night, there is now a roving watch. My personal observation as both a passenger and captain on overnight dive boats is that previously this Coast Guard requirement was paid scant attention, no more. Battery charging, there is and was already plenty of data on lithium battery charging issues, and the increase in the number of rechargeable dive devices has ballooned in the past couple of decades. As a result, there's no battery charging after hours, limited charging during the day. Fire detection and alarms, additional detectors should be wired together, so if one alarms, they all alarm. One thing about mini dive boats that I have never, in all caps, liked is access to the bunk rooms. Somewhere in the 80s, I think, the industry started building dive boats with a spiral staircase that typically led from the front of the galley area down to the bunk room. This represents a choke point that never sat well with me. A boat is a series of compromises, but as a small plug for the vessel Truth, it has a 6-foot wide staircase at the rear of the bunk room that leads directly to the aft deck and galley. I can attest to that. Very, very wide staircase. It's the only boat I can think of that has one that big, and it's not practical, as he mentions, on a lot of other boats. Final note, a number of these safety items issues have been noted to the Coast Guard for a decade or more. For whatever reasons, these were largely deferred or ignored by the Coast Guard, which has the jurisdiction over setting passenger vessel standards and auditing and enforcing them. I'm sure it has the Coast Guard's attention now. One of the complaints I've heard from other boat operators that I personally agree with is it's like we have these regulations, and every year you inspect the vessel and you say everything's okay, everything's okay, everything's okay. Now we get the conception fire and we find out, well, this was inadequate, and this was inadequate, and you should have known better. This was all your fault as opposed to ours for, not ours for oversight. So there's some amount of CYA that goes on here, I think. Dennis, your hand is up, and now I believe you're unmuted.
Yes, I am.
There we go. Much
Thanks,
better.
Ken. Earlier, you mentioned something about fishing vessels. Is that a fish of a different color, or are they going to be under the same regulations as dive boats?
Well, and maybe I can again remind you, Adams, NTSB, not Coast Guard, but I can maybe defer to him a little bit on that. Here's the deal. I would say, let's take a dive boat, and next to it is a recreational fishing boat that's going to take out 40 fishermen overnight. To me, it's the same thing. They got bunks. They should be, under the same regulations.
Right.
But the way that regulation is written, where it says, except for fishing vessels and ferries. So I can get the ferry idea, like, the smaller Catalina Express boats that don't take, over 150 people and but they also don't have overnight accommodations, would be exempt. But Adam, the intent is that a recreational fishing vessel would be covered by these regulations as well, yes?
My understanding is, first of all, the definition of fishing vessels, according to the regulations, is different. So fishing vessels are regulated under different Coast Guard rules, different subchapters in Coast Guard, same as ferries as well.
Yeah.
However, a ferry can be, as we discussed, the subchapter K vessel. So it really depends. What is important is fishing vessels, per regulation, are not carrying passengers that are out there for for compensation, for hire, for any type of excursion. In other words, persons employed on fishing vessels are crew members. So they're under the different regulations. They're under different training standards and drill standards, familiarization standards as well. So I believe, and I have not dug deep into the Coast Guard verbiage there, but I believe that's where it originates from.
So basically, a recreational fishing vessel, and this is one thing sometimes where you have so many different players involved. I say this, which to you means something else, and to someone else means something else. I would assume a what we would call a recreational fishing vessel would qualify as a small passenger vessel, and therefore be under those subchapter T or K regulations.
So any vessel, any fishing vessel that decides to take passengers out for compensation or for hire would be privy to those regulatory requirements. So you just can't, for example, say, I've got a commercial fishing vessel here and I'm going to convert it and put a bunch of bunks on board. Well, if you do that, then you would be required to comply with the either subchapter K or subchapter T requirements, because now you're bringing people on board who are paying to be on board for whatever variety of reasons. And they're not crew members,
Right.
therefore they're not required to do firefighting training, life-saving training, or any of the other training that most crew members in the United States are required to do before getting employment.
I know, I'm gonna throw you a
So the
curve.
common factor would be the overnight accommodations.
Well, that's where I was going. That's where I was going with it. So everything in here in the regulations keeps throwing in the phrase overnight accommodations, overnight accommodations. So again, I'm going to give Adam some cover here. He's not a lawyer and he doesn't work for the Coast Guard.
That's
Brad,
right.
of course, is a lawyer, so maybe we merge the two of them together.
Right.
But this is my serious question. If a dive boat said, screw this, I'm ripping out all the bunks, and literally ripped out all the bunks and has no overnight accommodations, does that exempt them from the rules?
I'd have to take a look. They would still be a subchapter because they still have passengers on board the vessel.
Yeah.
It could be a day tripper. And we all know the day trippers, they can have 150, 200 passengers if they want. So again, we're dealing with if the vessel has overnight accommodations, or if it doesn't, if the vessel is intending to use those overnight accommodations versus if it doesn't.
Well, like I said, I mean, the boats I've been on, it's not like people necessarily want to go down there and hang out for long periods of time during the day, but you know, some people store their stuff down there. And then I've been at, like the boats I've been on recently, you go down there and there's a couple of people sleeping, you know, sort of crashed out on the bunks. And it just doesn't seem like anybody's paying any attention to them. And
Yeah.
and how the briefing, it's not clear enough as to what those people should do if they wake up and see smoke or smell smoke. It's like the boats are pretending like nothing is going on down below.
Yeah.
There are no people, there's no nothing. When you go down there, there's maybe 5 people have stored their stuff and 2 people are napping.
Dan, I see you've unmuted. Are you?
Well,
have-
I was
have
just
to add here?
gonna say, yeah, when this tragedy took place, and I listened to the entire report when it was broadcast, and
Yeah.
I immediately sent out a number of recommendations to Mike Lever and a few other people in the liveaboard industry about some things that I thought they should do. And one of those things that I did with, and these were all as a volunteer because I wasn't paid for doing it, but if they had an SMS manual, a safety system manual, they had to make sure that the crew really understood it, and to guarantee the crew understood it, for at least Nautilus, I wrote a test that all the crew members had to take. So they have to understand it. They have to pass the test. They have to pass the test regularly because that's updated regularly. Also, I was concerned about the PA systems in the living quarters. So I suggested that whatever the PA system is, it had to be broadcasting at some number of decibels above the ambient noise. So they had to know what the ambient noise was down there. And also whatever protocols they were going to establish for evacuation, they had to know it works. And all the crew members had to go through a timed exercise where they had to, from the living quarters, find their way out in a certain period of time and blindfolded. And it had to be timed to make sure they understood how long it was really going to take. And any evacuation signage they had to be able to be read by people who are on their hands and knees.
Yeah, good. All good stuff. You know, if none of you know, I assume everybody knows who's Dan is, but if you don't, he was the former president of Dan and is a well-regarded safety expert and usually our January speaker as well. I'll throw in another plug for Nautilus. Mike Lever, who Dan mentioned, is the owner of the Nautilus boats. And actually, Brad, you were with me on this trip. We were on the Socorro trip.
Right.
So number one, they announced there's going to be a crew fire drill, and that's fine. And just like, you know, we were going down to Socorro, so it's a day and a half to get down there. We'd already done a passenger muster drill with life jackets and everything else. Then they tell us a couple of hours later, and we're, you know, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. There's going to be a crew fire drill. Well and good. And sure enough, it goes off. And these guys, they've got fire retardant stuff. They're pulling out hoses. It's really good to see. And then, okay, and end of drill. An hour later, the fire alarm goes off, and it ain't no stinking drill. And what was interesting there was number one, the Nautilus crew sprang into action. What it ended up being is there was some loose wire in the engine room that was sparking enough not to cause a fire, but set off the alarm. And what was interesting there, and for those of you who've been on a liveaboard, you've probably experienced this. On Nautilus, the life jackets are all generally in your staterooms. So we had just finished lunch. I was up in the salon. I happened to be near the stairs for the to go downstairs, which is also where you had to go, where they had to go to get to the engine room. And suddenly a couple of my people start to go down the stairs, and I stopped them. They said, well, we need to get a life jackets. I said, no, get out on the back deck. And as I explained later on, number one, you're trying to use the same stairs that they need to put out the fire. Number two, and this comes out of the Red Sea aggressor fire thing, where allegedly the woman who died went back to get something to her room. I said, I don't want you going down where you're suddenly going to get in your stateroom. And as you come out, you're going to suck in smoke. You're going to die down there. Get out on the back deck. We'll find stuff. So I talked to Mike about, should we have, where should the life jackets be? And, my view is, we're on a boat. I'd rather have you jump in the ocean than try to fight your way back up, back up the stairs. David, question?
No question, just a statement. I was on the Spectre last week, and I like to go underneath to just put into my wetsuit. And when I was down there, when they gave the briefing, the crew came down to make sure everybody was out. Now,
Good.
Later, when I go under there just to get something, nobody's paying attention to anything. And it was interesting that all the life preserver, the jackets were up on the top on the bridge as opposed to where everybody can grab them. So I guess they'll throw them down to you if there's a problem.
Well, there's a reason for that. And Adam has said many times that I've heard him say, fire burns up. So if you have the life jackets down low, guess what's getting burned up? If they're up high, you got a better chance of actually getting them. Just a thought. Anyone else got anything to add?
Just curious,
Yeah.
Ken, complete curiosity question, but we were talking of Nautilus and number one, Dan, I completely agree, and those sound great. And the one thing I should state is that Coast Guard regulations, the regulator, that's a minimum standard of regulations. And it's encouraging to hear vessel operators are out there operating in the realm of above and beyond minimum compliance standards. And it's refreshing to hear that. Curious to know, and you don't have to tell me, that is a curiosity question, are these vessels under a U.S. flag, or are they under a different flag? In other words, are they under different national regulations?
Dan, I think they're all Canadian flagged, but they operate in Mexico.
No, Vanuatu.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they're under Vanuatu flag.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
At least they're not Liberian tankers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also, and not to belabor the Nautilus issue, but Mike also installed sprinklers on his vessel.
That's a big lifesaver there.
Yeah.
And I mean, that was the other thing I was wondering, Adam, I mean, if you could address it, because the first thing I was thinking of, we have these heavy duty sprinkler systems. I realize sometimes they're halon, you can't breathe that, but in engine rooms, that the idea is if there's an engine room fire, boom, this thing's going to douse it right away. Why was there no similar requirement to have sprinklers in the salons and the galleys and the bunk rooms and stuff like that in your recommendations?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And sprinkler systems do exist on certain types and certain sizes of vessels. I come from a passenger ship background. There's a sprinkler head, and everywhere in every cabin and every space on a vessel. However, measuring practicality, measuring the cost to vessel owners, also understanding the size of these vessels, the weight of these vessels, and the safety measures that have been acted. For example, interconnected smoke detectors. We've spoken of the roving watch. Those defenses alone should allow for the rapid egress of passengers and crew members as well to get to an outer deck and to employ firefighting measures before things do get out of control. That's kind of the going on memory. Again, keep in mind, the report is nearing 2 years old now. So
Yeah. Susie, you got your hand up? You're up.
I was just thinking it was a very interesting point about the US flag versus the other flag, because the US flag is apparent no overnight charging. The two situations I encountered where we were told no unintended charging as opposed to no overnight. One was a Mexican boat and the other was a Canadian dive resort where we were told we could not leave something plugged in and walk away from it. In fact, the Canadian dive resort, they had a light on the dining room and they'd say, there is something charging in someone's room. You need to go take it and unplug it.
that's interesting. And international standards, it can go both ways. There can be some countries for vessels, we call them flags, that have standards exceeding what the US Coast Guard has. Conversely as well, there are countries out there, flags out there, that have standards even less than what the Coast Guard has as well. And, if there's one takeaway for all of this, I'd like to rehash or state that, it's also be aware of your surroundings, be aware of the type of vessel, be aware of your location, be aware that sometimes a vessel may not be at the same safety standards that is currently with the US Coast Guard or other countries. So what I'm trying to say is, be cognizant of that. And for, if nothing else, for own self-preservation, take the time, walk around, understand the escape routes, stop the crew members, query the crew members. Sometimes, as we've experienced on certain vessels that were mentioned here with the Red Sea Aggressor, we may have challenges even with communication in English with crew members as well. Knowing where your life-saving appliances are, knowing your 2 avenues of egress. These are critical in understanding. And I drop back to an airplane. Everyone's been on an airplane. And a lot of people don't listen to the flight attendants, don't watch the flight attendants because it's seen it a million times. But I think most people know, looking in front, they see the exits and then look behind and they evaluate where those exits are as well. And that is safety critical, time critical, and certainly essential in the international field as well.
Mark Givello, Glenn, because you've had one question, I will come back to you. But Mark, you've got your hand up and I'm counting on you to do at least 30 seconds and I'll be right back while you're asking your question or making your statement.
Well, thank you, Ken. I joined a little bit late tonight. I just wanted to add a little bit here to the conversation. In my background in California diving, I have spent a significant amount of nights on overnight vessels up and down the coast from the northern Channel Islands all the way down to San Diego. And most recently, just about a month ago, I was on a multi-day overnight fishing trip, which was a totally different experience than being on a dive boat. And so I wanted to kind of share a couple things on that. And what I will say is, in terms of like the overnight watch, you made a comment earlier about fire not really being on the radar, and I would really support that comment, because in the overnight watch, there's a lot of things that happen on a boat during the night that most people will never be aware of. People get sick, people go out on the deck. That's all true. I've been on boats and the anchor slips. I've had boats hit an island. I won't name names in some of these things. But I want you guys to still go on these boats. But anyways, the point being is fire really was not the main concern, although it was discussed. And there are boats that have done better pre-dive or pre-departure leavings, or like as Ken had showed up, underway, as the boat's getting ready to start leaving the harbor, that there's a briefing that's going on that talks about safety and so on. And no doubt, I'm thinking that these briefings are going to be augmented and changed for these new regulations that are coming, and just there's a heightened sense of awareness. And so in light of that, when I went on the fishing trip recently, you know, there was a pre-departure briefing, but it was pretty basic, honestly. I mean, more basic than it would be on a dive vessel. Now, because it's a multi-day trip, everybody's going to get a bunk. Knowing what I'm in for, before I even worry about where the fishing poles go, I go down to the bunk room and secure a bunk space right next to the egress. You know, I'm a little sensitive to the conception situation, and many of the passengers on the vessel weren't even aware of the conception situation. It wasn't even on the radar. So the berth area of the front of that boat, and it's built in a similar fashion to boats like Horizon and Truth Aquatics vessels, and they're different, but there's a lot of similarities. Same era, same type of format, same type of construction. The egress up at the front, there's basically as you get to the bow, like a V shape, and up at the top, there's a steel ladder that goes to the egress, and it's about the same size as Ken was speaking to earlier. My bunk was if there's any problem, I'm already on the ladder before there's even an alarm. I mean, that's just what I chose because that's where I'm most comfortable, knowing that I want to be able to egress if there's an emergency. We also, because it was so hot, the hatch was left open at night for additional air ventilation and flow. So there was literally no obstruction to get out of that vessel. But the general vibe is these are paying passengers, and people want to have fun and go fishing and go diving, and safety and concerns for safety and egress and what's going to happen is not really what's being discussed even amongst the passengers. I mean, there's a sort of assumption that if something goes wrong, they'll know what to do, the people who are working on this boat. And that crew definitely had people up throughout the night at different times. To Ken's earlier point, there is no one person who takes the graveyard shift, but the guys do sleep during the day. So there are those that are sleeping during the day, and they're kind of having to split it up. But that's the working life of working on a boat. Like, you know, and I can tell you from working on the boats years ago, it's part of the job. And usually your watch is a couple hours, so it's not 6 or 8 hours during the night. You get up and do your job. And there's a lot to be said for some of the ideas, Ken, that you suggested in terms of the key card or something like that, as you have to patrol the boat and get around. But on most boats that I can't even think of an exception. If you were on watch and you fell asleep, you were fired when you got back to the dock. You didn't work again on the boat. There was a zero tolerance. Your job is to be on duty. You can watch something. You can read a book. A lot of the days nobody had phones in those days, so it wasn't like you can play on your phone. And in most cases, they don't work out there anyways. But the point being is you had to do a shift, and it was that important. So being aware and patrolling and going around, that didn't necessarily mean that the watchman was going down into the bunk areas and looking around at everything. They would poke their head down there to make sure everybody's kind of asleep and all is well and quiet. And that's really about it. But I think a lot of the ideas that are being shared and expressed in terms of both proposals and enacted and things that have been put into action, and I think to what the gentleman from the NTSB was saying, Adam, is great in the sense that right now and for a while, you will have a very heightened awareness amongst boat captains and crews and in the diving community among passengers. Where it goes in 5 years and 10 years and 15 years from now, people tend to get complacent as time goes on. That's just kind of how humans are. We tend to forget these things and just kind of move forward. But I balance all of that out with the concern in terms of someone who works with boat owners and speaks to boat owners regularly. They don't make a lot of money. They don't have a lot of, window for adding sprinkler systems. I mean, these boats are not built to add sprinkler systems, even though it's a great idea. It's kind of financially impractical, and they're just as soon as sell the boat and give it to somebody else before they want to go through some of these measures that are financially quite exhausting. So there's sort of a balance between trying to do as much as they can to do things right, and there is in many cases more that can be done and should be done. But as also, I think that there's a reasonable expectation. If you've got awareness and you've got people addressing things like the batteries. The battery's a big question because it's really, if you're talking fire, that's one of the biggest concerns. But having someone that is awake at all times and an alertness, and honestly, during the day on a trip to Catalina, if someone goes down and lays in the bunk, I don't think they need to be checked. I mean, I don't, unless they're sick or there's an illness or a possible DCS situation. That's a totally different thing than someone that just says, I want to go take a nap and skip the second dive. But there is some things that can be done, and it's good to see that this many people. And Ken, thank you for bringing all that information together to share it, because it is quite informative to share that with the group. So thank you guys.
And to a couple of your points real quick, Mark, I mean, I always heard the night watch referred to as anchor watch. It's never been referred to as a fire watch, because you want slipping anchor or there's another boat going to run into you or whatever it is. And in terms of shortly after this, I got a call from Kenny Hess, who many of you know was the owner of the Encore and the Charisma. And he told me that one of the first things his father, Roger Hess, explained to him was that when you have someone who's assigned to the night watch, you give them a list of things to do so they won't fall asleep. Says you don't want them just sitting around at 3 a.m. because they're gonna maybe fall asleep. So all good stuff. Thank you, Mark. David Wilson, you're up.
The midnight chores is what they used to call that.
That's it.
Yeah, Ken, earlier you talked about the difficulty of the night watch, rover, whatever, going around and hitting all the different spots that they need to hit. With the cost coming way down on CCTVs these days, it seems to me that might be some way to ameliorate that problem.
Absolutely.
And maybe that's something that the Coast Guard can, in the future, take into consideration when they write their regulations.
Now, I may not have this totally correct, but I think I do. The Sea Ray had told me if they didn't put it in, they were going to put it in. But exactly what you're talking about, the boats are relatively small in terms of surface area. And like you said, you could have 5 or 6 cameras covering every inch of the boat and going into a monitor in the wheelhouse that displays all 6 images at once. And again, if we're looking at fire, you would see a fire immediately. And you either use that instead of or as an adjunct to, but absolutely, I mean, I think it's absolutely a great way to go. And like I said, my concern is, I'm doing the roving patrol. Well, I'll back up. One of my frustrations sometimes in dealing with, specifically at times, some of the Coast Guard people is you have non-divers, making rules, and what looks good on paper may not work well practically. So the idea of the roving watchman, great. He's in the lazarette. He doesn't see the fire break out in the galley. And when he comes up, we're back at the same place. So yeah, I like the idea of, how can you be in all places at once? Well, video is a good way to do that. Good suggestion.
And not to forget, which was an NTSB recommendation, and I believe this is the absolute first line of defense. We have them all in our homes, and that's smoke detectors.
Oh, absolutely.
And especially the interconnectivity. So if one goes off, they all go off. I mean, regardless of where that roving patrol is, at that moment when that detector goes off, said individual, if he is anywhere but, that still assures the time to alert, to evacuate, or just hit the fire before it gets and evolves to be so far out of control that it becomes a major problem.
And I think, and Adam, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong about this, but one of the great mysteries, I think, with the conception is why no one heard a smoke alarm. And according to Glenn, they had been tested like that week, but there is no evidence that any of obviously the crew people, the only survivors, ever heard anything going off. And you would think if a smoke alarm had gone off in the bunk room, people would have been up and out of their bunks, and you would have had at least 1 or 2 people survive.
That's correct. As applied to the conception, as discussed in the report, is the fact that the origin of the fire, the location of the fire is critical. Smoke goes up, fire goes up, and by the time smoke goes down, it's usually in a fully evolved state. And so by the time the smoke will hit a detector in a location below a fire, is time critical.
Tabby, you're up next.
One of the things that people had mentioned about batteries and stuff was the fact that a lot of the boats had very inadequate electrical systems. Has any thought been given that you know of to improving the electrical systems to allow more power? Since in the days of just alkaline batteries before rechargeables, there was no need for it.
I'm sure people are thinking about it. It's not in any of the requirements that I've seen. I think I'm remembering correctly in the NTSB report. It was no mention of faulty wiring, but I think you may have mentioned something about you saw stuff on the Vision that was similar to what was on the Conception and questioned whether it was a good idea or not. And according to Glenn, the wiring was all, top notch and the correct stuff. So I don't know.
Enough wiring to allow for the charging without all the extra.
That I don't know. That's why I say, should there be specific charging areas or charging outlets that could be designed exactly, for that to carry a heavier load. And again, it gets back down to, that would be, and this is again the problem that, and as it says in the NTSB report, the fire of unknown origin. Could it have been electrical? Well, I suppose it could have been. Could it have been the battery? Seems that way. So is it a question of faulty electrical causes the battery to explode, or battery causes the electrical to overload? Don't know, but the point would be if you can address both of those, you're probably limiting the chances of it happening again. So it's certainly not a bad idea to improve any electrical stuff. Glenn, your hand is up. Patiently so.
Oh, yes. So as far as the electrical is concerned, it's not the ability to provide the electricity, especially on a boat, because all of the electricity is generated by motors, engines. The problem is actually how clean the sine wave is. And that's fairly technical. That could be addressed by having all the chargers run on battery voltage. And that would be the cheap and dirty way of doing it. And the other thing I'd like to add is because CCTVs are relatively cheap, I'm thinking of a possibility of combining that with essentially a timer that would go off every 5 minutes in the quarters, so that even if somebody was nodding off, they would have to
Still
turn a
acknowledge it.
key or
Yeah.
press a button in order to turn off an alarm.
Well, they have these actually wheelhouses now that they're sort of out of reach of the guy who's steering the boat, but you got to go over and whack the button every 20 minutes or whatever it is. I mean, and that's the other thing that I was reading one thing about this that said, how often should you have to acknowledge that you're awake? And someone said 30 minutes. And the irony there is at 2:35, we know that there was nothing going on in the galley, and probably around 3:05, 30 minutes, there was a fire going. So what is the right thing to do that? I believe, and I think I've got this correct, that early on they were talking with someone on a Coast Guard vessel about, well, what's the pace at where someone has to come back? They said, oh yeah, we're really on top of that. You got to pass by once every 3 hours. We're going, that ain't going to work on the dive boat, on a smaller dive boat. So it gets back down to what's the frequency that you have to pass the same place. And if you're going to say, well, you pass by every 5 minutes, every 10 minutes, you're just going to have somebody sprinting around the boat. So where's that balance?
It's all dependent on vessel
practical,
size,
what's
too.
safe, and everything else.
Yeah, but my question is, what's the advantage of making someone walk 10 feet every 20 minutes as opposed to having them push a button on the console every 10 minutes? To me, the latter would be better than the former.
Well, the walking ensures that, like if you look at these little key stations,
Yeah.
the only way to key in, you have to go to that
Okay.
specific station. But yeah, again, it goes back to, what's the rate at which you should pass the
Right.
same place
Right.
twice?
And
And
my
are there
only
places
point
you
is
should
that
pass more often?
if the key is that somebody's awake,
Right.
sentient, then it seems to me that I would rather have a person who is pushing a button with an arm's length every 10 minutes than a person who has to walk 20 feet every 40 minutes or
Yeah.
45 minutes. That would be my preference.
So perhaps at the end of the day, it might be like what we do, like what I do with COVID. I find out what the boat has in terms of like fire safety. I was on the Coralia in Indonesia. That's an Indonesian flag boat. They literally had 2 people up all night long. And they were masked. So it's sort of like we have to do things in our own best interest in some sense and find out beforehand what the situation is and then figure out what we're willing to deal with in terms of our
Level of risk.
level of risk.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And actually, Glenn, you bring up a real good point there, which would be, and boy, does this tie it back to diving. Should there be a buddy system with the night watchman?
Yes.
In other words, what are the odds of 2 watchmen falling asleep as opposed to, one? And we look at it in diving in theory, and I certainly dive alone, but I know there's added risk. Well, if I got somebody with me, that gives me a different level of safety. If I've got the second watchman up, they're sort of watching out for each other. But now, again, you go back to the cost thing and everything else. You're increasing the cost, and at what point do you have people just going, to hell with this? I'm chucking the business. David, you have another question?
Yes, I did want to mention about the question about the rover versus the TVs. The one benefit of having a person physically walking around is, as long as their senses are working properly, they are also likely to smell a problem,
Sure,
as well as see it.
sure.
And
Excellent.
don't want to overlook that.
Yeah, excellent point. Let me share with you.
And here as
Go ahead.
well, and
Yeah.
here, because
Yeah.
not only fire, somebody falls overboard, you hear that splash.
Yeah.
The anchor starts dragging, you're going to hear that, you're going to feel that. So an awake and alert human being, there are so many elements of the senses involved here.
Yeah. Well, it's actually when when the rule was written about you could no longer check on airlines your rechargeable lithium batteries, you had to put them in your carry-on, and it initially came out, it was a little unclear as to what was affected, what wasn't. And I happened to see the press release, and there was a phone number of the press person at the Department of Transportation. So I called her and I said, Ken Curtis, and calling on behalf of the dive industry, since we know I overinflate my own importance, calling on behalf of the dive industry in California. And I said, we need some clarity on this. And she said, would you like to talk to the guy who wrote the rule? I said, well, yes. And she gave me the number of this poor guy who then I verbally was able to assault. But I asked him, I said, and this goes back to the smelling, hearing, seeing thing. I said, was this you guys sitting around a table going, hey, this could happen, we should write a rule about it, or is this based on actual stuff? He said, no. He said, we have actually had batteries, catch fire in the hold. He says, we've never lost a plane yet. He said, but we thought it's better to make you bring those batteries up into the passenger compartment because 150 noses are more likely to detect the smoke or realize there's a fire than when they're buried down in the hole. So sort of that same idea of human detection. So I think that's an excellent point. Let me share with you guys one other note that I got from someone else who's been diving on the local boats, and I won't mention the boat names. So boat number 1, given the newer requirements relative to a limited load for overnight trips, some of the boats early on, the Coast Guard went around and they negotiated a lower number of overnight passengers, whether that's a good or bad decision, but that was the initial reaction to some of this. limited load for overnight trips. I don't think it's worth it for them any longer. I don't see them really scheduling overnight trips. So that's the other thing that we've lost from some of this is not as many overnight trips, meaning Santa Barbara, San Clemente Island, San Miguel, et cetera, et cetera. This particular boat added a new exit from the bunk room to the bow deck. So they now have 3 exits from the bunk room, installed an interconnected smoke alarm system. For overnight trips, they did install a type of alarm on a timer that has to be pressed every 20 minutes or it goes off. But no more staying on the boat overnight if you have an early AM departure like 5 a.m. to Farnsworth, unless, and this goes back to, I think, what Elaine mentioned, unless the person chartering the boat agrees to pay for a night watchman, which usually doesn't happen. And the second boat he dives on said they already had an exit separate from the galley and an exit to the back deck. They don't allow any overnight charging anywhere, no charging at all in the bunk room itself. They've always been good about a rotating night watchman, as he says, and this is a quote, as I can attest to every time I have to get up and pee. In general, I do feel safe on these overnight trips. So just another perspective there. So anyone else have anything they would like to add here as we're sort of at the wrapping up portion there, and poor Adam's got to get up early in the morning to catch his plane as well. I'll remind you again in the chat, if you scroll all the way to the top of the chat, if you haven't already, I did put in the direct link to both the NTSB final report and the Coast Guard new rules. If you want to have those, again, you can Google them to find them as well. And I do appreciate the fact that Adam took his personal time to be able to hear and shed some insight on what they found and everything else, as well as I appreciate all you guys hanging with us through this too. So this is
Ken.
one. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you. I thought you said, hey, Ken, I had something to add. Thank you. Thank you, Dan. This was one edition of Zoom Seekers that I've been looking forward to for, I mean, maybe looking forward to is not the right word, but anticipating for a year. Because again, I think one of the problems we have in our industry, and it even starts in basic classes where sometimes we're reluctant to say, hey, this is a sport that can kill you. We tend not to talk about the bad things because, gee, we don't want to give it a bad spin. But an informed person is a better educated person and a safer person, and I believe that all the way around. So hopefully you walk away with some more ideas or at least things to think about. And remember too that as divers, we've got some input in this. We're a fairly self-regulated industry. A, because we're small, but B, because for the most part we do an okay job on everything. And one way to keep that up is that we keep saying, well, we should be doing this or we should be doing that. And since we're the consumer for the boats and everything else, I think we've got a lot more clout in that than you may sometimes realize. So I appreciate all you guys hanging in. I will remind you that next month, October 11th, again, it's a Tuesday. Our guest is Mark Legg, AKA Dr. Rock. I first met Mark in 1996. He was a geologist on board the boat Atlantis when I got to go do my Alden dive off the backside of Catalina. And we were picking up rocks looking for the evidence of earthquake faults. And I've stayed in touch with him for the last way too many years here. But he's a very interesting guy, and he wants to talk about underwater geology in around the California area, and specifically Catalina. And one thing I'm sure we'll talk about, if you ever dive the Arrow Cove area, there's actually a very active earthquake fault right there in the Arrow Cove area, and we'll talk about some things that have happened there over the years. So that is next month, October 11th, and we'll hope you guys will join us for that. So I go back to gallery view so I can actually see everybody. And I thank you all for your rapt attention. I see my friend Linda McMullen, who's the green screen. She's in Australia having lunch because it's like 1 p.m. there. So we really did make this a worldwide thing tonight. Thank you all for spending time with us. Much appreciated. I will hopefully see you guys all next month or here and there. And have a great week, and thanks for participating.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
All
Thank you,
right, Kenny.
everybody.
Good night.